Thank you for joining us for this panel on how will the white paper impact on Scottish communities. As I'm sure all of you are aware, in April this year, the UK government's white paper was published entitled High Stakes, Gambling Reform in a Digital Age, and since then, Gambling Commission consultations on what that will look like in practice have been ongoing. So for today, we've invited our expert panelists to reflect and comment on how the white paper will impact Scottish communities. Just a quick disclaimer, we anticipate that this will be quite an engaged discussion, so my apologies if I do have to move any discussion on at any time to make sure that everyone gets a chance to engage. And we'll try and keep as quickly to time as we can. So we'll start by asking each panelist to introduce themselves before I'll then ask them to comment on the organizing question. Georgina, if you'd like to start.
Hi, lovely to meet everyone. I'm Georgina Charlton. I'm a programme manager with the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, and one of the programmes that I lead is Scotland Reducing Gambling Harm. And we work with people with lived experience to inform and try and prioritise the change in Scotland that should be seen at a policy level and also at a local authority and community level as well.
So I'm Jill Scott-Rowley. I head up the tobacco, vaping, gambling, diet and healthy weight unit within Scottish Government. I'm not an expert. I'm just learning a lot around this because of my policy area. And I co-chair the Gambling Related Harms Working Group, which has been set up to look at the white paper. And I co-chair that with Public Health Scotland.
So I'm Councillor Laura Doherty. I'm from Glasgow City Council. I'm the political lead within the administration for gambling related harms. I also chair the Wellbeing, Equalities, Community, Culture and Engagement City Policy Committee, which is the policy committee where the gambling related harms work goes through. I'm also the chair of the Gambling Harms Multi-Agency Group in Glasgow, which includes members from the Health and Social Care Partnership and the Alliance as well.
My name is Mark Comey. I'm an individual who has sort of lived experience of gambling harms, and for those of you who've been at the last workshop, probably guessed also experience of the criminal justice system. I do work with sort of organisations and charities working in the gambling harms sector, particularly in the treatment sector, and try about advising on sort of involvement of lived experience and engaging with people who are accessing services. And I'm also a member of GambleWare's Lived Experience Council.
Thank you. So if you'd like to start, Georgina, with a comment on how the white paper will impact Scottish communities.
Thank you. I'm going to try not to steal possible follow-up points for people who have a little bit more expertise in these areas. So some of the things I might touch very briefly on. I think there are opportunities for community sense change at a physical level, so both positively and negatively. There's stuff in the white paper about casinos changing, about there being more slot machines, about there being less table-based games. There's some changes around licensing and what that means for Scotland, where there's historically been a bit of a grey area in terms of how that goes forward. I'm not going to speak much more about that because, Laura, I'm hoping that's something that you're going to be picking up on. And I think one of the biggest things that we're going to see within communities be different is really just the existence of services. So the statutory levy, the possibility for investment and for money and for funding in Scotland, I think has the potential to really significantly change the landscape of just what is available. At the moment, there is some treatment support. We've heard a lot about RCA Trust and GamCare throughout the day, but there's not much else. There's nothing really within the NHS, and apologies, I've missed Gamblers Anonymous off that previous list as well. Yeah, there's not much around the NHS, there's not much formalised, there's not much community-based support, and there's really not much funding available for it. So when we start to think about what's available within the third sector, what's available within the NHS, what's available to support the growth and existence of recovery communities, and those places where people can come together to call and shape the agenda of what's needed, that statutory levy, I think, has the potential to start building some of that. And to take that a tiny little bit of a step forward, this isn't necessarily included within the white paper. I think the white paper was a little bit light, actually, on the implementation and how the legislation goes forward in practice. But my hope if it is done effectively with the involvement of lived experience, with a full evaluation and review and monitoring plan to sit alongside it, is that we will start to see a bigger understanding of what exactly is happening at a community level. And I mean that in terms of place and prevalence, but also in terms of different communities of interest. We just had a really, really interesting and great presentation on the LGBTQIA+ community. And there are so many other communities, women, different racial communities, different faith communities, that we don't have a strong understanding of not only the level to which are being impacted, but exactly how are being impacted and what they need in terms of prevention, treatment, and support to address. So I think that there is potential through the current funding that will become available to meet and do that and respond to that community need. But that needs to happen, and that needs to be committed to by Westminster, by other national governments, by ourselves and some of the other people in the organisations in the power in the room to do that. Thanks. I'll pass.
Thanks. So unsurprisingly, I will agree with all the points that you've just made. I do think the levy is a real big opportunity. It has the potential to have funding to come into Scotland to progress this, so to progress treatment, but also to address prevention and information. I've been speaking to people in lunch talking about how we support children, how do we support young people, how do we have those conversations. So funding to come to feed into that, but also the research, as we've just heard, is that actually we don't understand the prevalence, or we know this is happening. We know the groups it might have, that it might be affecting, but we don't have the numbers to put at it. I think the Public Health England report that came out, and it said about the number of completed suicides that happened, that are attributed to gambling, and it was a range for England of something around 150 to 450 per year. But actually trying to delve into that to understand what that prevalence is in Scotland, what groups are most affected. We heard in the panel session I was in, I think it was Wendy that was talking about actually to understand the impact on them Black women, to understand these groups, how do we actually reach them? I think this is where the white paper has a real opportunity, and the fact that we're sitting here talking about this, we're having these conversations, I think that's a real benefit as well, because actually it's put it on the agenda. It's having people thinking, well, actually the levy is one aspect of it because it's got financial implications. But as soon as you think about the financial implications, people start to talk and they start to go, oh, but that's what we can do. And actually that for me is one of the big opportunities, and really happy to be involved and to try and help progress.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start off with touching on licensing. As far as a council perspective, there isn't an awful lot of clarity currently when it comes to the licensing and regulatory committees within councils, whether or not they can grant licenses for or can refuse to not grant licensing applications to gambling premises. So yes, clarity on that, and also would be able to empower local government to essentially be able to say, no, we're not going to issue you this license, without the fear that they might then have to be going through a legal challenge on that decision. So no, that certainly would make a big impact, and especially I think on the councillors that are a part of the licensing committees and boards, to empower them to be able to make those decisions. Obviously that doesn't tackle online gambling and gambling links to gaming, which I don't think the white people touched on anywhere near enough. But as far as the statutory levy, obviously money is what we all need to be able to tackle these problems, and I would be interested to see how that levy will be allocated and how that will be devolved. I would like to see that that's devolved on a population based, because I mean, as we've spoke about, there's very little research done on gambling related harms, and there's even less research in Scotland. So if it isn't done on a population base, there's the concern that Scotland will almost be done out of a fair share of that money, and then how that money is then allocated, whether that is administered through national government and national care, or whether that comes to local government. I obviously have a preference of where I would like that to go, because every local government is going to have different needs. You know, what gambling related harms prevention treatment will look like in the Highlands and Islands will be different from how it looks in Glasgow. So I think it's important that we have a look at what's already been done in local authorities, and there's a lot of work being done in Glasgow. So how can the funding be used to tailor support to our communities I think will be a big benefit and a big challenge as well. But yes, money will certainly help. The statutory levy would be a huge benefit to us, certainly.
As you've already heard, one of the words that comes out quite a lot just now is the levy. And forgive me for saying this, but I understand why, from a political point of view, that's the thing that grabs attention. The question is communities. Well, as we've already heard, communities are so diverse, it's very hard to identify what a community is. And each community will have they'll have unique perspectives to them where harm might be occurring in different ways and different respects. So rather than looking at individual communities, I would like to take Scotland as being a general community. And when we look at that, the white paper is a mix of good things, a mix of bad things, and an awful lot in the middle, which is neither good nor bad, and quite a few things where it's undecided yet as to what it will be. But if I look at what I would say were the obvious good things, unequivocally good things, would be the first thing is it's obvious there's going to be a move to create a maximum stake for online slots. It will probably bring it in line with what's now the maximum stake for sort of land-based slots or the fixed odds betting terminals. I suspect it will be £2 per spin on online slots. Reason why I say that's important to communities is online slots have been proven to be the most toxic, if you want, gambling product in terms of the amount of harm that gets generated from them. Even at £2 a spin, currently the spin times take 2.5 seconds. There's talk about raising up to 5 seconds. So you talk about you might still potentially be sort of spending £40 a minute. So you're still talking about over £1,000 in an hour. And with slots, the evidence has shown that when it comes to online slots, that's once again it's a product where people have spent longer on it. 70% of single product sort of gambling sessions are on online slots that are over 3 hours. If you think over 3 hours spending sort of up to £40 a minute, up to sort of £1,000 an hour, that's an awful lot of harm that can happen there. So I think the fact that's almost inevitably going to come down to parity of land-based, I think that's a good thing. The other thing that I think is a good thing from it is the marketing. They're trying to stop direct marketing and trying to split it so that when people sign up for marketing with gambling companies, they have to agree to sign up to marketing for each specific product stream. Whereas at the moment it's a bit generalistic, which means that when people, if let's say they're interested in bingo or they're interested in sports betting, if they sign up to betting companies so they can bet on those things or play in those games, they then get marketed, trying to get sold across to, as I say, more addictive products such as the online slots. So the fact that people are going to have to have permission for each of those products, I think that's a positive thing. The other thing which isn't open for consultation yet, but is coming, which I also think is very important, is the player controls. The thing about gambling is most people drift into harmful gambling without realizing they're doing it. And the way you can make people realize that their behaviors are changing is by forcing them, or requiring them when they sign up to gambling, we're talking mainly online here, to set limits on how much they can spend or how much they can lose over a given period. That's because once people start, the danger with gambling, developing gambling harm, is you start off, as everyone does, it's harmless to you, and you don't really notice it's kind of an imperceptible change in your behaviors. And at some point, everybody needs a nudge to be able to say, wait a minute, your behavior has changed. Because if you don't have these limits, so you get an alert saying, hey, what you thought wasn't acceptable 6 months ago, which you thought would never be an issue for you 6 months ago, you're now encountering this. What do you want to do about it? So I think that's a good thing. We have to make sure that player controls become mandatory rather than optional. At the moment, I think there's less than 10% of people who gamble who use set their optional limits. I think that's a good thing. The bad things, the actual name of the white paper is sort of high stakes, sort of addressing gambling in the digital age. And the trouble is the white paper is focused very much on the online side of it. And to some extent, the land-based has been allowed to relax. Georgina mentioned earlier that one of the things that people in your communities will be discovering is things like casinos. The number of sort of gaming machines that casinos allowed has gone up. In some cases, you're talking about going from 20 machines up to 80 machines, even in places like bingo halls, whereas before there was a proportion of you'd have to have sort of 4 low-risk category D machines before you could get a B2 machine, etc. They talk about bringing party in there. So what does mean, if you're playing, for instance, if you're going to bingo, which is traditionally seen as being a communal activity, one where people do together, and it's kind of leisure-based. It has an ideology of it, oh, we're just going down the game of bingo with your mates. And you can understand that's the leisure side of gambling. But the move from the white paper is to try and turn that more, take from the communal aspect of people gambling together, sharing a bingo card, to people gambling individually on the machines that are there. And another thing that's coming up that's in the white paper that's not been consulted upon yet is looking at the possibility of then people having side bets on bingo games. So instead of you all playing the same card at the same time, you can have an individual bet on the hand when it's been playing, which once again, it takes away the idea of communal involvement and creates almost an insular, gambling is an individual in a supposedly communal environment, and that's a bad thing. The things which are middling are, or rather the things which are undecided, I'd say, are, they talk about ombudsman. That's a good thing, because up to now, people who have encountered problems with gambling companies through social responsibility failures, they've had nowhere to go to. The Gambling Commission kind of is there, but the Gambling Commission has never been public facing. So ombudsman is a good idea in principle. But the white paper, yes, the thing that we've been talked about just now is the levy, the change from what was a voluntary RET system whereby the industry would agree to donate so much money. That would then get distributed mainly through Gamble Aware as the commissioner, and they would then commission services like the National Gambling Support Network to pay for treatment. The move to the levy is a good idea in it creates a fixed amount of money, but the danger here is it's who's responsible for the commissioning. The way it's worked out, they're talking about moving the commissioning of treatment from sort of what was traditionally the third sector, the voluntary sector, which currently provides 90% of all treatment and support for gambling harms, and trying to move it to the responsibility of the NHS to create commissioning for. I don't object to the NHS, but the NHS aren't really experts in the area. They gambling harms deals with they have got a one fit solution for gambling harms at the moment, which is treatment clinics in England, which, as has already been mentioned, we don't have in Scotland or in Wales. And even when they have all 15 clinics upline, they're talking about only being able to sort of capacity for 3,000 people a year, when the existing infrastructure treatment ecosystem already deals with 3 or 4 times that each year. So that's a slight worry. But when it comes to Scotland, the levy does have one benefit, which is they're talking about applying a kind of Barnett sort of formula to it, so that they recognise that the levy that comes in should be divided sort of equitably across the nations of England, Wales and Scotland. What this does mean is that if you follow Barnett proportion, or even just the population proportion, there's a chance that Scotland could have between sort of £6 and £8 million in terms of prevention and treatment funding to decide what you were to do with. And on that respect, one thing I would say is, yes, there are no treatment clinics in Scotland. The RCA Trust is there, and they deliver fantastic CBT-based sort of treatment, and through themselves and all through satellite organisations throughout Scotland, like the Tayside CA and Inverness CA. So treatment is delivered that way. But there are other treatments out there. If you want residential treatment, for instance, Gordon Minnie's there. They don't have a place in Scotland, but Gordon Minnie's is available for residential treatment for anyone, whether you live in Scotland, England or Wales. And the other thing I'd say is, just this really a shout out to Jules here. There has been in Glasgow, a Reducing Gambling Harms in Glasgow initiative. That a lot of the money for that came from funding from the UK Gambling Commission through what was known as the Social Responsibility Fund, which is basically money that's been taken off gambling operators in lieu of fines. And one of the pots of money that came that way was funding the sort of Reducing Gambling Harms in Glasgow, and a lot of that aspect went through what was then the Scottish Public Health Network, which has now become Public Health Scotland. And at the time, we had some fantastic people in Scotland looking into this, so it was Professor Phil Mackey and Dr. Michelle Gillis. And basically, when the funding for that stopped, that kind of initiative and momentum that came from that went. So I would certainly hope that depending how where the money goes, that if the Scottish Government does get hold of some money, they would consider sort of pumping it back into sort of Public Health Scotland. Because the one thing, one thing about, this is the last point, the last thing about the white paper is they're talking about dividing the levy into proportions for treatment, for prevention, and for research. And at the moment, as anyone who understands the public health sort of model, the focus should always be on prevention rather than treatment. If you concentrate on treatment and not prevention, then you're basically just creating a self-sustaining sort of treatment model which will always exist because there will always be need for treatment. Whereas what we really want is the focus to be on prevention so that the treatment is not as necessary. So I think there's the imbalance there. So I do think Scotland have got a chance to take a lead on making sort of a national prevention, national messaging an important part so that people in Scotland are made more aware of the dangers that they are at. And I think that's where the benefit of the levy comes in for Scotland and for Scottish communities.
Thank you very much to our panelists. I'll open it up to yourselves now if you have any questions for our panelists. Yes. Sorry, I'll be handing over my mic.
Thanks. Lisa Patton, I'll probably say it again, I'm Adult Support Services for GamCare Scotland, delivering treatment in Scotland. I just wanted to ask, obviously the white paper is important and it was around something that's come from lived experience, and it's around scratch cards. And we obviously are very fortunate enough to hide cigarettes now in shops throughout Scotland, and that's for our young people as well. And I just wondered if there was any scope for that in our local authorities for that. And sorry, Laura, I'm not targeting you, but if there's any scope for that through the white paper as well to actually recognise that it's just coming back from lived experience of hiding actually scratch cards because they're everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, this is literally something that was spoke about in the last workshop that I was just in, about the design of scratch cards and how, you know, the gambling industry knows what it's doing as far as trying to entice people into buying these products. Whether it's a local authority legislation or policy that's needed, or whether it is perhaps national government that's needed. But as far as, you know, we now do things where we have cigarettes hidden behind shutters and things like that. I don't think that there's any reason why we can't look to maybe implement something similar with scratch cards, whether they're under the counter, they're not advertised, but if you ask for them, then yes, granted, you can get them. We also spoke about in the last workshop about them not just being in things like supermarkets but discount stores, and discount stores specifically being in communities where people are more likely to be poorer and have less, and the targeting around that by the gambling industry and things like scratch cards. But yeah, that's something that I would definitely be interested in looking at how we can progress that. I do think it wouldn't necessarily be local government policy that we need to change. I think that would have to come from national government, but happy to hear.
Yeah, and I think licensing is not an area I lead on. That's another colleague, so it's not my area of specialties. But I do think it's thinking about these kind of things, maybe that the legislation, maybe things like primary legislation that would need that has a really long lead-in time. And I think that's the thing we need to recognise, that some of these things may need a long lead-in time. So what can we do now? What kind of conversations can we have in our local communities with the retailers, with the different organisations that are selling these, to actually try to say, well, actually, is there anything we can do, or is there anything we can pilot with people to say, can we make these changes? What can we do? Because anything that does need legislation can have a long lead-in time, and we need to be very aware of that. It doesn't preclude that can happen, but I think it's just thinking that there are more than one way to do things. And I think working with local authorities to say, actually, is there anything we can do together? Is there anything we can do around information, around guidance, around just even having the kind of conversations with people around these, around what is appealing, why is it appealing, and trying to think about what are the underlying drivers that are making people use these, trying to address the underlying causes. So if, say, poverty is one of these causes, actually, what can we do in our communities to support around these aspects so that actually maybe people don't feel the need to then use them. Now, obviously, that's not going to solve everything. It's trying to think about what are all the different levers we can use try and work at things from lots of different angles. And I don't think there is a one sort of fit approach. We have to look at lots of different angles and actually hearing from the voices of those in the communities around what is really of interest for them and actually what can we do together. And I think it's that kind of cooperative approach I think we need to take.
Just to really briefly add a final couple of thoughts. Private companies have a huge amount of power on a lot of these issues, and particularly when it comes to things like advertisement and arrangements of shops, etc. I don't necessarily think that we can trust them to regulate themselves and act in the best interest of communities and people and health. I think we've seen that with advertisement, we've seen it with football, we've seen it with sport. However, I don't think that means that we should stop calling for it. And I don't think it means that there's not a strong role of gathering evidence, creating public voice and creating public campaign, because I completely agree with Jules on the point that primary legislation and that formal regulation takes a long time to come. And it often only comes when community and society is calling for it, pushing for it, and pressurizing politicians to do it. So I think that is a really key aspect, to keep raising it, have wider society understand how harmful and dangerous these things can be, and keep putting that pressure on.
Yep, just to follow on from the scratch card comment, which I thought was really important, and Mark's comment, and just what Jules was saying about prevention being key, and I couldn't agree more. But it seems to me, we've got some time. The levy's not coming in straight away. The levy's coming, and it's going to make a big difference. But we can't do any of this stuff, and we can't start thinking about policies unless we have a plan. So I know our gambling group, I've said to Jules before about the idea of some sort of gambling strategy, which fills everybody with horror. But, I come from tobacco control. We have a tobacco control strategy. And it seems to me that all this, time, that we have some time where, we've got enthusiasm, but we need a plan. These prevention strategies aren't just going to come out from thin air. The treatment services aren't just going to, we need to have something. So, I guess it's a plea for some thinking around what kind of framework plan can we start doing now, so when the levy comes in, we're ready, we're in a strong position to go. So just comment the panel's thoughts on that.
Just to agree with that, we need a plan, and along with a plan, we need commitment. There needs to be commitment to that plan and to implementing it. And I don't think I'm going to be adding much beyond what you've said there, but also that needs to be led by people who have been harmed, including affected others, because otherwise it's going to be a plan that doesn't work and doesn't meet the actual needs within it. So I would agree with your call and comment.
And I think, I'd agree as well. But I think that the voice is a really important point, because you need to understand what communities need, what people need, and it's kind of coming from both angles. It's the plan from coming sort of down from the different layers, from UK government to Scottish government to local government, but also at the same time kind of ground up what is needed, and actually then that where your plan or your framework or your strategy, whichever we want to sort of angle it as, that's the bit in the middle where that kind of work has kind of come from both sides, and there's an agreement and a commitment from everybody around the table around what is needed and how we progress. And there's a kind of opportunity now to do that, and I think this is where the white paper has catalysed action to sort of say, well, actually, we've got this opportunity, where do we go from here? And I think that how we involve the sort of ground up into the work we do, I think is really important, and really welcome views, because I know we've got some kind of conversations we've had around that, but actually trying to formalise that, but also local government as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add on that, we launched our gambling harm strategy in Glasgow this year. So I would definitely be super keen to see the Scottish Government do something similar, especially with the, in expecting the levy to come in. But yes, the gambling strategy in Glasgow launched this year, informed by an awful lot of the work that we had done previously, and also a lot of work that came out of the Gambling Summit that we'd had in 2020, which members from across various organisations were involved in. So yes, to see the Scottish Government do something similar would be good to inform the kind of work that we're going to be able to do with the finances that come with the levy.
I would just like to sort of respond to the question by pointing out, yes, I think it's very true. The levy's coming in the future, but the planning should have been happening before now. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of sort of producing strategies for reducing gambling harms in Scotland and across the UK, there was one. There was a national strategy to reduce gambling harms. It was a 3-year plan that was ran from, I can't remember, 2019 to 2022, something like that. And as part of that, there was a Scottish strategic implementation group that was set up to plan to organise the reducing harms in Scotland part, well, the part of it for Scotland, sort of by shorthand known as the SIG. My understanding is the SIG was meeting, it was doing fine, and then when it got to the end of the funding, when the national strategy for reducing gambling harms came to the end of 2022, the SIG, it was never disbanded, but basically it never met again. And I'm sorry to say that this is something that should have been done. The planning, we should have been planning ahead. We should have known the things were coming up. Even if we didn't know where the funding was going from, we should still have been continuing that program. What I would suggest, an excellent piece of research or background into gambling in Scotland and the harms it affects was, I mean, I've name-checked this person before, but Dr. Michelle Gillis, and I think in 2014 or 17, I can't remember, she did a sort of what I would say was a seminal piece of looking at Scotland and how gambling harm pervades through it, and if you want a pathway for what we should be concentrating on going forward. So I would certainly advise anyone to look that out if you're looking for suggesting for planning for taking this forward in Scotland.
I think we've got a couple. I think there was somebody in the middle before Fiona spoke, and if not, it's a question from Wendy.
Hello, I'm Wendy. I've got 3 things, so you can choose whatever you want to talk about. But in terms of the white paper, so it's how will the white paper impact Scottish communities? I'm interested in underrepresented groups, right? So migration, international students, and those who have got no recourse to public funds. What does it look like up in Scotland? Because obviously I'm from England. Do you know where these communities are? And is there a strategy? What are the strategies around migration? Trauma is the next. You know, you see me fanning myself. It's my menopause, yeah? So traumatic stages. Menopause, bereavement. The white paper doesn't talk about trauma and its links to gambling addiction. Has Scotland thought about this? And land-based provision. Do you do any mapping? The demography. Do you know where the land-based provision is in relation to your most disadvantaged? Because I know, like in Chelsea, London, the demographic is very different to West Yorkshire in terms of its land-based operators. So those are 3 areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So underrepresented communities, and you gave a few examples of migration, international students, and apologies, I don't remember the third one. Then there was the point around traumatized communities or traumatized individuals, and then the point around mapping. So I guess to take the first 2 on underrepresented communities and trauma, not enough, essentially is what I'd say. There isn't a significant amount of lived experience work happening in Scotland at all. So as I've mentioned, I work within lived experience. We support the Scottish Lived Experience Gambling Harms Forum. We have found it very, very challenging to engage at a general public level without necessarily moving into particular underrepresented communities. And I don't say that as an excuse. I say that as from the starting position of the issue is so hidden and so stigmatized that these conversations are really just initiating within a lot of pockets. Now, having said that, there is a vibrant and established third sector within Scotland already that are linking with, we've had the examples of LGBT communities, there's a whole load of different racial third sector specialist communities. We've got BMIS, MECOP, extensive other ones. And there's already organizations who are working with these communities who are well connected, well established, who have trusting relationships with those individuals. And it would be my view that it is more about necessarily increasing their knowledge around gambling harms so that it's going through people already well connected into those communities. However, when we've initially had some of those conversations, funding is really, really tight and capacity is really, really tight, and everyone wants a little bit of their time. So that is where my hope that some of the statutory levy in the future is going to be able to free up and actually pay for the good work and the time that goes into this, because too often we expect it freely, and too often we think, oh, just because it's something that is going to be good doesn't mean you can magic time out of people and organizations who are stretched and underserved already. So essentially not enough. Also on the trauma point, there's a wealth, and Jules, you may be able to speak to this better, but there's a wealth of strategies already happening within Scottish Government around, I think menopause was one that you brought up. There's a women's health plan which is being taken forward within Scottish Government. There is the new health self-harm strategies, there's new suicide strategies, there's the new mental health delivery plan, and those final three that I mentioned, they do have reference to gambling harm in them, so that is movement in the right direction. However, there are so many other aspects and policy areas which also need to be connecting gambling harm into this, because it doesn't exist in isolation. I think we all know that. It's not individuals who are harmed by gambling are here and they don't touch any other life experience. So there's definitely a work to be done in terms of expanding that recognition across those areas. And then the third point on mapping, I'm not aware at a national level, but I know that there's been work done in Glasgow to map, and I'll leave that to Laura to pick up on.
Yes, as far as mapping, we have done work in Glasgow over mapping what we would call environmental bads. And what you find is in communities which are considered to be more deprived communities, you have entire high streets where you will find the bookies, you will find the takeaway shop, and you will find the pub all next to each other. And how often you find those three environmental bads next to things like community centres, youth centres, primary schools, we're finding that quite consistent across communities where they are considered more deprived communities. As far as the data on different demographics, at a local authority level, we do have data on our population across other policy spheres, in things like homelessness, things like education, health and social care, and how we then relate those policy areas to pick up on the issues around gambling related harms. I think is conversations that departments need to be having with each other and officers need to be having with each other, because it is there and those demographics and those people are identified. So there is information there that we can tap into, but those conversations need to be more succinct and be happening more regularly.
I'll just mention that we've got 1 minute left, so if either Mark or Jules would like to have a brief comment to wrap us up.
Yes. When I heard that I was coming on the panel and Laura was going to be here, I did a very quick search on Google, because I didn't know she represents the Shettleston ward in Glasgow. I didn't know where Shettleston was. I looked in Google and I saw it basically stretches from sort of Celtic Park, sort of Parkhead, where you got the Daffabet of advertising that, along to Mount Vernon, I think I'd say. And I just did a quick walk along. If took the main route from Mount Vernon to Parkhead, I counted you passed 15 bookmakers on that road. On that walk, and I think that tells you something. No, very quickly on something Wendy said, I think as a society in Scotland we consider ourselves to be very inclusive, and the other thing about being society is you're not always aware of how others see you, and I think Wendy's raised a point about people coming in from other societies and other cultures. The one thing that often happens is we don't understand enough that gambling is a societal harm, and what happens is people often come from countries where gambling doesn't have the same hold, it might not be permitted, so they come in not having being exposed to gambling. They come to this country and they discover wall-to-wall advertising, and sort of the gambling is pervasive and it's in your face. And many people find themselves getting into harm because, if you want, they're not immunized against baseline level gambling. They walk in totally inoculated and get infected by the gambling here. And I think as a society, one thing we should maybe be considering is, if that's what's happening to a stranger coming to our country, our societal acceptance of gambling can affect them. Think what it's doing to our young people when they grow up. that's the environment they're growing up into. They're growing up into an environment where gambling is normalized and gambling harms are basically profitized and encouraged. Whereas a community, somebody coming from community outside, if you want, we should be doing more research into the effects of going there, because that gives us ability to see us through others' eyes.
I'm afraid I'll have to wrap us up there, but thank you so much to our panelists and thanks to the audience for this fantastic discussion.